Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We have people still logging in here to the webinar, so we're going to give folks another minute or two to join, and then we will get started. Hi again, everyone. In the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and get started. And thank you all for joining us today. I know I reached out to a lot of you directly, and I'm happy to have you all here for this. We are here today to talk about contract negotiations, and we're joined by Emily Rueth, who is the Managing Director of Vicuse Payments. And I just want to give a little bit of a background here on two things. Emily's got a history in the payments industry. She's worked as the Director of Cards and Payment Solution for First Financial Bank, Senior Director of Credit Card Product Management for Bread Financial, Director of Market Development at Citi, and those are just sort of highlights. You can kind of look at her career on LinkedIn, which is how she and I met. And we got to talking. She reached out to me, and we started to talk about some of the work that she did and a little bit about some of the contract negotiations that she had been involved with and some of the work that she had done in the card space. And I said to her, this is all really interesting, and I'm happy to kind of learn this information, but I'd really like it if you could share it with our members, who I think would gain a lot of value from it. So with that, then, before I turn it over to her, I just want to make a couple of housekeeping announcements. We will record this webinar, and it will be available afterwards. And if you are interested in receiving the deck, Emily will have her email at the end of her deck, and you can reach out to her directly, and she will send it over to you and is happy to answer questions. And we're also happy to take questions during the webinar. You can put them in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll be monitoring for that, and we'll bring all the questions together at the end. And with that, let me turn it over to Emily. Emily?
Great. Ben, thank you so much for that warm introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you today. As Ben had mentioned, we're talking about contract negotiations. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, so let's go ahead and just jump right on in. So some of the topics that we're going to be covering today, we'll start with getting started. So do you have a new relationship or an existing? Second piece we'll touch on, is this an extension or a renewal? And how can you decide what is the best path to pursue? We'll also talk about, does a contract negotiation make sense? Sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. We're going to go through the finer points of that. We'll also step through the 5-step contract negotiation process, and then we'll also talk through some best practices. So every business relationship has an underlying contract. It's really a demonstration of trust between two parties. And contracts specifically, they detail the expectations that both parties have. They ensure confidentiality of trade secrets as well as intellectual property. And the terms really help to maintain a strong cooperation and interaction. They also give assurances that obligations are going to be met. And if obligations can't be met, contracts then provide the ability to really bring about legal action if that is the path that needs to be taken. So when you think about all of this and the importance of contracts, really 52% of best-in-class businesses are actively renewing their agreements on an annual basis. That really leaves a lot of room for opportunities that are not being captured by businesses today. But it really doesn't have to be this way. With some time, organization, and focus, more and more businesses would be able to tackle renegotiations. So let's get started with, what are the first two questions that you really want to pose to think about the best path for you and your business? The first question is a new service provider even needed? The second question is, does a contract negotiation make sense? It's really that simple when you think about that as a starting point. So let's say you're looking at this from the standpoint of a new service provider is needed. Let's step through what that could potentially look like. Providers are found in a number of ways. You can look through business referrals, so reaching out to peers, whether that's peer businesses or peer banks, asking them for vendors that they may be working with currently or that they've heard about in the landscape. You can also talk to industry experts and obtain additional names. And then once you've identified the providers, you're going to initiate an RFP or a request for proposal. This type of document, very prevalent in the industry, and it really helps to identify what your business is needing. So it's a document that's going to be authored by you. It details your project, the service, or the needs. It then is sent to vendors asking them for bid. So you've commonly heard RFPs being put out for bid. This is where a business is going to look at your request. They're going to determine if they're in a good position to answer it, and they're going to provide you details about their own organization. Typically, these organizations will have their own templates and their own processes that they follow when they do the response. If you are doing an RFP, it's really important that you engage either vendor management or procurement within your own organization. Reason being is oftentimes banks or service providers, you're also going to have your own formalized templates, processes, and procedures that need to be followed. Usually governance is what's really dictating that. So just when you think about the RFP itself, there's really 5 additional steps when you go through the process. So a couple of call outs when you're thinking of an RFP, these do take a considerable amount of effort. And this is where your procurement or your vendor management department is really going to be able to step in and assist you. However, authoring the RFP typically is going to fall to the vendor relationship owner or manager. The first step that you're going to go through is creating just a comprehensive document. As we had just talked about, it's really focused on your business, the background, and the needs. You also want to be sure to edit the document because this could potentially be public facing or reach the public domain. So you want to be very cautious in terms of not including any overly confidential information. If you do have that need, it's best to reach out to vendors directly and maybe provide them some additional documentation or have additional discussions around the confidentiality piece. You also want to be sure that you're giving vendors enough time to respond. So when you put the RFP out, depending on the complexity or the service or the work that needs to be done, this could mean that responses may not come back anywhere from 2 weeks to 30 days, maybe even longer. In my experience, 30 days seems to be the norm for most vendors to provide a response. And as we think about responses, one additional call out is that oftentimes the comparison process in and of itself is truly a process. The responses don't always come back in a very cohesive or well-organized way, especially when you start talking about pricing. Oftentimes vendors will bundle the information together. So it's really important to just take your time, pay attention to the details, and be sure to ask the vendors questions if you have follow-ups or if you need clarity on the information that was provided. Once you step through that comparison process, then you're going to go ahead and select the vendor, and that's where you're going to begin your contract negotiation process, which we're going to step through in a bit more detail here in just a moment. So the RFP process is not just for new relationships only. It's also a tool that can be leveraged for existing vendor relationships when you're going through the renegotiation process with those. So we're going to revisit RFP a little bit later in the presentation. So if you'll recall, we started out with 2 questions. So the second question, does a contract negotiation even make sense? This is in the case of where you have an existing agreement that's in place, and you're trying to decide if you want to continue the relationship with that vendor. So you're really thinking about two paths that you potentially could go down with an existing contract. The first is a contract renewal. The second is a contract extension. And you'll hear these terms, they're used interchangeably all the time, but they actually are two different processes when you really break it out. Contract renewal is a very active process between the parties. It's resulting in the creation of essentially a new contract. Even though language, maybe some of the addendums are going to be similar to your current agreement, there will be some tweaks as well as amendments that might need to be added just to reflect changes in priorities or changes in the relationship. And then contract extension, a very passive process. This is just when the agreement auto renews for a specified period of time. It's usually already written in the agreement. So as you think about going through which process you want to take or which path you want to go down, one of your first steps when you're thinking about a contract renewal is just conducting an initial assessment. And as you're thinking about the assessment, there's a number of areas that you want to evaluate or just ask some due diligence questions around. What's on the page here, these are a great starting point or a great jumping off point to help you get started. So walking through just a couple of these, let's go into a little bit more detail to give you an idea of how you could be thinking around business needs, market conditions, and information security standards, as well as rating and costs. So for business needs, this is really just thinking about, have the needs of your organization evolved since the agreement was last renewed? This could mean that the vendor is potentially no longer relevant. Your company might require products or services that are a bit more advanced than maybe what the vendor could provide or is providing to you today. You also want to think through if the vendor is really truly meeting your business needs, or is it time to seek an alternative? Market conditions is really identifying the current economic condition. So an upturn or a downturn in the economy can drastically alter the outcome of your final agreement. So for example, currently we're in a high inflationary environment. Many vendors are under considerable pricing pressure on their goods, their services, as well as their payroll expenses, as are you. So if your contract was originally negotiated during a time when these items weren't such a factor, you may choose just to do an automatic extension versus trying to enter into an active negotiation to ensure that the pricing that you might have in place is secured for a bit longer, hopefully long enough to where market conditions have changed and they're more favorable to you versus your vendor. Information security standards on this front, let's face it, needs have undergone significant changes and advancements in this space in the last 5 to 10 years. So you really want to ask yourself, is your vendor keeping pace with the latest legal and compliance requirements on this front, or are adjustments needed? Same thing with your technology needs. And then rating and costs. Costs are oftentimes really the driver behind wanting to open up a contract and going through the negotiation process. I would really encourage you that cost is not the only reason to go through a negotiation process. And as you're doing your evaluation, this is one of the places where these additional add-on items will really come to the surface. So when doesn't a contract renewal make sense? There are reasons why you may not want to open things up and start to initiate that conversation with your vendor. There could be a clause just making the negotiation impossible or very costly. It could be that your contract as well as your vendor relationship are perfect. Everybody's aligned with your business goals. The vendor is performing very strongly. Or it could also be that there's just a lack of business need, meaning that the contract is actually going to sunset. You and the vendor are going to part ways because you have somebody else either waiting in the wings, or it's just the end of the relationship, the end of the product and or the service. And if you go down the path of not doing a negotiation, know that there are advantages to that contract extension path, or auto extension. So as mentioned earlier, typically an agreement is going to have a clause anticipating just this type of scenario. They're known as an evergreen clause. They're typically always written into every contract that you'll see. And the subsequent term that you'll be entering into is always clearly defined and is typically for a predetermined or defined period of time. Ones I've seen typically go for a year, sometimes 2 years. I haven't really seen any auto renewals that go for an extended version that are longer than that, but you really wanted to check the language within your agreement and make sure that you're clear on what you're signing up for. So let's now talk through the contract negotiation process itself. This is where you've made the decision that this is the best path that you want to follow. So before you begin any type of negotiation, there's several things to be mindful of. First and foremost, renegotiating a contract, it's not easy, but the outcome can be very rewarding. You want to really be prepared to manage the people, emotions, and time that is part of the overall experience. So number one item is minding the relationship. A negotiation is really, it's a collaboration between the two parties. This is not the movies where people are screaming and yelling at each other and jumping over tables. The objective here is very different. You're really wanting to preserve and build the relationship as part of this process, not to tear it down. Remember, you're negotiating in good faith because you want to continue the relationship, which means you have to work with these individuals going forward. So you really want to try to make this as much of a rewarding experience for both parties as much as you can. But with any relationship, there are going to be emotions, which can and do run high during this process. So keep in mind that this is business. It's not personal. The individual that you may have developed a terrific relationship with on the vendor side, keep in mind that they're not trying to take advantage of that special relationship. They too have a job to do and a vested interest to negotiate for the best outcome for the company that they work for. And that's what they're working towards as well. Same kind of objective as what you're going to have. So if for some reason you're the point person for the contract and the point person for the negotiation, and you think that there's going to be a struggle to separate out the two between business and emotion, there's absolutely no shame in asking someone else who's not necessarily part of the day-to-day to step in and serve as a proxy. Also be mindful that these negotiation processes, they are resource and time intensive. It's just not going to be possible for whoever the lead is of the relationship or the negotiation to really know all the current and future business plans that could play a role in the outcome of the contract. So given this, it's really important to engage key stakeholders in the process and giving them a voice at the table. And we're going to cover who these individuals should be and the role that they should play here in just a moment. And then cost. You'll notice cost keeps coming up as a reoccurring theme. Something to be mindful of here, this cost that I'm talking about is just a little bit different than what's in the contract itself. And that's really about bringing in outside resources, such as attorneys, perhaps business advisors or consultants could be necessary just to ensure the best possible outcome for your business. You really don't want to shy away from engaging these individuals as they can help you save significant time, effort, and expense. And when you think about the terms of any agreement, they're typically multi-year. So there is a lot that's riding on this type of a contract. So if you need assistance or you need additional insights, go ahead and bring in the outside help to give you that direction. So when you boil it all down, believe it or not, as you're going through the negotiation process, there's really just 5 steps. There are 5 long steps, but 5 steps nonetheless. And we're going to go ahead and walk through each one of these. So the first one is assembling your team. These are the key stakeholders that we had talked about earlier. So the stakeholders are really going to be determined just based on the complexity of the contract that you're looking to renew or the relationship. Not all of these key stakeholders are necessarily going to be involved or at the table. This is more of a menu per se, but there are a couple of people or areas of business that you're going to want to consistently engage in regardless of the contract that you're negotiating. So the most important folks are first the relationship owner or the owner of that vendor, the vendor management and or procurement team, your legal department. This could be inside counsel, perhaps it's outside counsel, depending on the contract itself, as well as finance. Everybody else could be truly optional, or they might play more of a support role on your team. But again, it's people to consider being engaged. The one piece that I did put on here that I want to call out is your board of directors. So board of directors, depending on the financial or the risk impact of the contract to the organization, the agreement may need to be reviewed and approved by by your board. So it's important to identify really or early on if they do need to be included in your plan, and if so, really fleshing out how much of the agreement needs to be reviewed with them, how often do you need to provide ongoing updates, and what needs to be provided to them once the contract is signed and the relationship is moving forward. The next step that you're going to then go through is the assessment and needs analysis. And very early on, if you recall, you have already done an initial needs analysis, but this is an additional layer of information gathering that's really intended to go deeper than that first swing. And we're going to talk through several of these in just a moment. So a needs analysis is going to help you accomplish a couple of things. First, it's going to ground all your stakeholders in the importance of the relationship. If you think about it, if you're the person facing off with the vendor on a day-to-day basis, or you're the relationship owner, the person that has information security or compliance, they may know very little about this vendor or the relationship. So collecting the information and then reviewing the details with these individuals is just going to help them become more comfortable, especially if they're playing a support role as part of your key stakeholder group. You also want to ensure that you're gaining alignment on people's interests, their goals. This is really going to help reduce instances of any kind of conflicts or disputes that might arise from your stakeholder team during the process. It also really helps just to pave the way to tailor the contract and the asks to both the current and the future state of the business. So conducting this upfront legwork and due diligence is going to be critical, just also for helping you, if you're the person with doing the negotiation, gaining confidence for the talks that lie ahead. So when you think about the assessment phase, let's walk through just a couple of these. So business goals and objectives is always of critical importance. You might be thinking that just because the vendor is doing business with the organization, that both parties absolutely must be aligned, but that's not always the case. Business environment and needs, they're constantly changing. You want to really look at your organization's goals, ensure that areas such as performance, quality, customer service, delivery expectations are all aligned between yourself as well as the vendor. You also want to make sure that that provider is contributing to one or more of these areas in terms of quality and consistency on an ongoing basis. If they aren't, it's best to uncover that up front and be able to pivot your approach or your ask versus later on when the negotiations are well underway. You also want to take a good look at the contract terms. Legal agreements, as we touched on earlier, they're in place for a reason. It's not only to help with the relationship ins and outs, but it's also there to protect the interests of your organization and to reduce any kind of legal or financial risks in the future. So the contract is really serving as that governing document of the relationship between you and the provider, and it's spelling out all of the conditions. So going through each one of these questions and making sure that you're very clear on what is in your current agreement is also going to help you as you engage the vendor and have those ongoing conversations. And a good place to start so that you're not having to do all of this on your own, this is where your legal counsel is also going to come in. Again, inside counsel, outside counsel, it doesn't matter. A good attorney is really going to help you get a full understanding of the terms and conditions of your contract. They're also going to be able to interpret any kind of legalese language that's in the agreement, as well as help you identify what needs to be refreshed. Oftentimes legal language can age out, especially if you have an older agreement. So this is a great opportunity to bring in maybe new terms that need to be added. Also, a good attorney is going to take their time, answer your questions about and help guide you on your expectations, your desires, and what you're wanting to accomplish as part of this process. Vendor performance is another area that you really want to dig into deeply. You may have had experience with the vendor for the duration of the relationship, which is fantastic, but sometimes people overlook when things may not have gone so well. That could be around quality, that could be around consistency. So it's important to take a look back and just say, is the provider still working well and still working in your best interest? Or are you seeing where quality might be starting to slip or fall short? Are you also communicating your needs frequently and often in a clear and concise way? So it's not just always looking at the vendor, it's also looking at how you're working with that provider. Service levels and quality, this is really around, have they been met consistently, excuse me. Is the quality of the output of the work meeting the expectations? Or have there been incidents when the vendor just didn't deliver in a timely manner? And then the health of the relationship is really around, is the vendor easy to work with or are they challenging? Are they responsive to you, your issues? Do they answer your disputes in a timely manner? And then also, are you as a business owner or business easy to work with, or are there additional challenges that could potentially come up? And then regulatory and compliance, especially if you're a bank, we all know that this is a highly visible area where everything truly needs to be buttoned up. Here too, you really want to go through and ask yourself from a data security standpoint, privacy, as well as third-party relationships. Is your vendor really meeting the expectations that your organization has defined and designed in order to keep that relationship on a good standing? And if any of these things are a no, dig in a little bit deeper and start to create a list, if you will, of asks or things that will need to be brought into the negotiation process. And then finance. Finance is also a terrific key stakeholder that's going to help you not only with the comparison process if you go down the RFP route, but they're also going to help you just assess the overall financial impact that this vendor might be having on your business. A couple of good places to start that's also going to help you just in the renegotiation conversations. take a look at your monthly invoices. And what I would recommend is, if you can, do a line by line for a couple of your invoices to really show the true expense breakdown of the vendor relationship. Typically, there's going to be just several line items that are driving the bulk of your total expense of doing business with this company. And knowing these are going to be helpful just to your overall negotiation, because you'll be able to really focus on those specifics instead of just broad general terms. And as we talked about at the top of the call, costs, this also helps to create a view just into the annual costs of the contract to the business itself. It will also help you identify if there's been any increases that might have been unexpected that came up during the course of your relationship. This could be due to any number of things. Maybe services have been added on, maybe products have been added while the existing contract was in effect. Maybe you didn't get the best pricing at that point in time. This is a great opportunity to bring those into the conversations and negotiate a better price point for yourself. Same thing with signing bonuses and incentives. These are typically on an amortization schedule. And by working with your finance department, that's going to help you understand any kind of end dates that could have been benefiting your P&L in a positive way. It's also going to help you with just understanding the offset to any monthly or annual expenses. And then finally, finance is also going to be able to assist in understanding, is the vendor financially and economically stable? One of the worst things you could do is go down the path of entering into a relationship with a vendor only for them to declare bankruptcy in a year or two. So really engage your finance team. They're going to be able to go down the path of asking for financials, making sure that they're getting that information that's needed so that additional vendor due diligence can be done. And if finance doesn't assist you with that, your vendor management and or procurement team should help you with that as well. So we had talked about RFP for new relationships. This is where an RFP could come into play for an existing relationship. So as you're going through your assessment phase, if you're feeling like the vendor just might not be aligned any longer with your business desires or goals, perhaps you feel that their pricing isn't quite where it should be, you can go ahead and solicit competitive bids and try to select the most suitable vendor out of the responses. Some things to consider here when you're going through an RFP process with an existing vendor relationship. So really, have there been performance issues? Is the current vendor just not meeting your expectations? We talked about market rate for a potential cost reduction. Understand that your economic environment is going to play in any type of responses that you get. You may desire some technology upgrades. There could be regulatory changes or even just business requirements. One thing to call out here is if you do go down the RFP path for an existing agreement, while it does provide transparency as well as competition amongst vendors, and it could be used as a tool just in your overall negotiation, just be aware that issuing an RFP is not necessarily going to guarantee that your incumbent is going to give you a better price. I've seen it many times where businesses will issue an RFP with the hope that they're going to be able to use that as a point of leverage with their existing vendor and really get them into a better position from a price standpoint. That doesn't always work out. And there's a whole host of reasons why that's the case. So make sure, once again, that cost isn't the primary reason that you're wanting to go to market and find another provider. Be sure that you have some other reasons that, when bundled together, really truly make strategic sense for you and your business. So step 3, you've come a long way up to this point. Now you need to develop your negotiation game plan. And your game plan is pretty simple, but I encourage you not to skip this step because it's very easy to say, hey, I've done the assessment. I've been having all these terrific conversations with my stakeholders. I know what everybody wants and needs. I'm just going to go ahead and move forward. Hit the pause button, hit the break, and go through the game plan process. This is where you're going to really define your goals and priorities. And as part of that, knowing these before you go into the negotiation is really going to just give you the clear direction that you need in terms of what it is that you're wanting to achieve. It's also going to help you to just avoid distractions from minor and less important details that are surely going to come up as part of the process. So when you're thinking about what you want to accomplish, a great place to start is set some SMART goals for yourself. Make sure these are clear, they can be easily articulated, and it's really going to help to avoid any confusion or miscommunication during the process. Be sure to share your goals with your stakeholder team. Let them have some input as well. This just helps with visibility as well as transparency with the overall process. Your priorities are really going to reflect the organization's values, the interests and the needs. You want to rank these in order because, as mentioned, this new process is going to be some give and take. So what are your must-haves and what are you willing to sacrifice or trade? You want to be sure to take that into account as well. And you're not the only one that's going to have goals and priorities. Your vendor is also going to have ambitions or things that they're going to want to accomplish as well. And if you can think through these and give it your best shot around brainstorming about what are some of those potential things your vendor could ask for, that's going to put you in a better position of power during the renegotiation. So some of the things that you're going to want to prepare in advance or think about what you might encounter is just brainstorm a list of potential priorities that they could raise, what the vendor may want to protect, or they could be willing to concede either fully or partially. And how you come up with that list is use just primary data from your experiences and working with and engaging with your provider. What topics or concerns do they seem to raise frequently in discussions? Go ahead and mark those down. You also may want to do some research and public available resources. So do a quick Google search and just identify if there's any recent news headlines that might indicate the overall business or client performance health, both positive as well as negative. And think about any constraints or concerns the vendor might raise as part of this process, either with their own organization or in working with you as a client. You also want to look for just areas of alignment and potential trade-offs overall. Oops. Next piece is creating the communication plan. This can be very short and simple, but it's also a critical component of the path that you're on. Having a well thought out communication plan with some clearly defined roles and responsibilities and timelines is really going to help you keep things flowing smoothly for both sides. So some of the things that you want to consider are who's going to be participating in the discussions. It's really important to keep the balance of power between the two teams. And by that, I mean, if they bring a director or senior director to the table, you too should have a director or senior director. But again, keep the group small, keep it limited to a number of people that are participating in the active discussion. This is really truly just to ensure that lines of communication are open, clear, and transparent. You also want to identify who's going to be the primary negotiator and who's going to be playing the supporting role. If you're the relationship owner and you're bringing vendor management to the table to help assist you with the negotiations, just clearly identify with those individuals who's going to take the lead, who's going to be support. It just helps with the flow of conversation. Identify what communication channels are going to be used. Is this going to be video conferencing or in person? Anymore, it's typically all video conferencing, so that may be lesser of a question that needs to be addressed. But if it's a local vendor, then you may have some in-person or face-to-face type meetings. So it's best to identify those up front. Also clearly write out a rough timeline for each stage of the process, but just be careful not to commit to any specific timelines. These discussions can often be very fluid, and timelines can go any number of ways. You also want to go ahead and plan for any periodic updates to your stakeholders, making sure that you're being planful about when and what you're going to update them with. So now at this point, you finally have gotten to the time when you can initiate the renewal and talk to your vendor about what's happening or what you want to achieve. So a couple of things on this front. First of all, choose the appropriate time and channel to alert your vendor that you're wanting to move forward with renewal conversations. This probably won't be a surprise to them. If they're keeping tabs on the contract and the timelines, they should not be surprised if you're reaching out to them and saying that you'd like to renegotiate on maybe some finer points of the agreement. You really want this initial contact to come from the relationship owner. Refrain from having legal counsel be the first one to reach out. It just doesn't set a good tone or precedent for the conversations ahead. You really want to also explain the reason and the purpose for the negotiation. As we mentioned, this is about building the relationship up, not about tearing it down. So really talk about the value that you've seen with doing business with the provider, the benefits that have come from working together, and really emphasize that this is a commitment to cooperate and find a solution together. You can also invite the other party just to share their views, their concerns, be an active and empathetic listener, and propose to take the lead in kicking off the formal negotiation process and agree on the agenda, the timeline, and the ground rules overall. So a couple of tips just for an effective negotiation. It's important to create and claim some sort of value during the discussion. Call out what's working well with the relationship, with the products, with the services, the quality and delivery. You're really trying to build trust and rapport. You also want to state why the continuation of the relationship is just important to both them and to you, and ensure your lead person can articulate clearly throughout the process, avoiding miscommunication and keeping conflicts more low-key, as well as providing constructive rather than critical feedback is really going to go a long way towards achieving your goals. Transparency is key. You both parties should plan to explain their position in just an honest and sincere way. And you want to be prepared with your prioritized list of must-haves and optional items that you've prepared in advance in order to give to the vendor. A word of caution here, though, you don't want to give everything away up front that you're asking for. It's okay to hold back some of your requests, and you'll get a good feel as the conversations start to progress. When is the right time to bring up some of your asks, and when is the right time to hold them back? You just want to be careful that you're watching your emotions as you're going through this whole process. As we said at the beginning, emotions can oftentimes run high. And the vendor may make statements about your business that you're not going to agree with. Just know that it happens. Be mindful that both parties are working in good faith and with good intent. So you're in the renewal process itself, the belly of the beast. What can you expect? This part can take months. Sometimes it can take weeks, but oftentimes it takes months. If you're leading the effort, I highly recommend that you don't set any kind of delivery date or communicate out specific deadlines to the internal team. The reason for this is that there can be pressure sometimes from executive leadership or from finance who may want to start realizing any kind of savings that the contract is potentially planned to deliver. So you're really truly trying to manage people's expectations appropriately. Timelines are typically driven by a couple of things. First of all, when you talk about the contract language itself, know that there's going to be several red lines or turns. That's literally where their legal and your legal are taking a red pen to the contract and marking it up in terms of the language, ensuring that both are getting to an agreement. It's possible that as you're doing this back and forth turn, sometimes changes are omitted from one version to the next. If it happens, just always assume positive intent. It's typically not malicious. It's usually just an oversight that just happens to occur. And if you're the lead for the effort, you're wanting to review each individual schedule as well to make sure that any pricing that's been agreed to has been captured, or any additional terms or services are clearly stated and identified and meet your expectations. And if you start to see that the back and forths are really dragging out and you want to speed things up, it's okay to suggest a call, especially when the attorneys get involved. Bring both legal counsels onto a call so that they can hash out any kind of language or specifics that they might be going back and forth on between each email version. Also ensure that any internal review boards, they're going to have their own set of approval policies and procedures, i.e. who needs to review and sign off on the agreed terms. They can also lengthen the process. So that's another group that you're just going to want to be sure that you're managing expectations and be very clear and transparent with your communication with them. And then your internal stakeholders also, as we've talked about, provide your regular and ongoing status updates. Know that renewal fatigue, it's truly a thing. Oftentimes, your stakeholders aren't necessarily involved or engaged on the day-to-day. They've got their own bill of work that they need to accomplish. So just be sure that you're keeping them in the loop and you're providing clear communication to them throughout, even if they are getting a bit tired of the process. Once the contract language and schedules have actually been finalized, it's now time to actually route for signatures, which will formalize the agreement and the renewal of the relationship. One thing you also want to be sure you have pinned down is just who has the signing authority within your company. This really should have been uncovered early on in the assessment phase. It's typically going to be somebody in the executive suite. So just be sure to communicate and alert this individual in advance that as you're coming towards the end of the process, that the contract is going to be routed to them for their signature. In the event that the person has not heard about the updated agreement or that you've been going through a renewal, provide them with a quick executive high-level summary so that they understand what they're going to be agreeing and signing to. And then your final step is you're reaching the agreement and formalizing the relationship. And success! You've done it. The agreement is signed. And before you can move on, there are a few housekeeping items that you do want to just sew up. First and foremost, send copies of the fully executed signed agreements to legal as well as vendor management. Notify finance and accounting if there's any kind of signing bonuses or incentive dollars that were negotiated out. Let them know when these are going to be paid and advise when the money will be dispersed and when your bank or your organization should be receiving those funds. Also, I recommend sending a thank you note to the vendor. This is now, you've made it. It's been a long, arduous process in some cases, and you've shown that together you can work to mutually agreed upon terms to further your relationship. So send them a note of thanks. They too worked in good faith to renew with you, as well as keeping the relationship intact. And this just makes for a great start to kick off the next however many years of your working together. And then celebrate. Take a victory lap. You've completed a successful negotiation. If you've not done this before, you've just built upon a whole new skill set that can be used again and again. If it's not been your first time, there always are learnings within every negotiation process. So just take a moment and reflect and celebrate your success. And then one final thing, we talked about outside help earlier in the call, and it's a question that every organization sometimes can struggle with when it comes to a contract negotiation. And everybody's got very different views on this. So here are just some benefits of seeking some outside guidance. This can really be beneficial if you feel like you've been working with the vendor for far too long and you really don't truly have awareness of the broader marketplace, nor do you have the time to go in search of other vendors. That's a great opportunity to bring somebody in. Another reason might be you just desire to have a neutral party serve as the liaison so that there's not any kind of harm to the relationship in any way. Keep in mind, if you're within your business, you're the one that's working with the provider on a go forward basis. And if you really truly are concerned that the negotiation process could become contentious, or there might be some damage done to the relationship, it's okay to bring somebody in to help serve as that party that's representing your interests to get you through that. Also, if you feel like your pricing or your terms could be better, but you don't want to go through RFP and you lack the market data really to make a good solid comparison. An advisor or a consultant that's worked on renewals will oftentimes have this data, and they'll be able to help provide an assessment for you to understand if your pricing is competitive or if there's opportunities for your provider to sharpen their pencil a little bit. Also, if you're going through an M&A event, M&A, there's always a ton of things that are going on. Oftentimes, time is not always on your side, even though you want to bring in another vendor. This is also a great time to just turn over the renewal process to somebody from the outside who's able to focus on things more fully and help speed along the event. All right. So as a recap, we've covered a lot of ground. First, we started out with those two questions that really served as a starting point. They seem very simple, but as you can see, as we walk through the process, it has progressively gotten a little bit more complex. But not only did the questions help us understand what path to take, it also helped us to define what was the best approach, an extension or a renewal. And if we went with the extension, we walked through those 5 steps, bringing a team together of stakeholders, doing the needs analysis, creating a game plans for when the negotiations actually began, initiating those renewal discussions, and then reaching an agreement, and finally closing out the effort and moving forward with our vendor relationship. So that brings us to the end of the contract negotiation process. I want to thank you for being a terrific audience. If we have any questions, certainly happy to answer all of those. But if you'd like to get in touch, as Ben had mentioned at the top of the call, if you're interested in getting a copy of this deck, or you just have questions and want to talk to somebody in general, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to just have an informal conversation with you, answer your questions or concerns so that you too can have a successful process.
Well, thank you, Emily. And I know we're getting close to the end of our time here, but if anybody has any questions, certainly feel free to drop them into the chat or the Q&A or reach out directly. I did want to bring up one item that occurred to me, and it sort of occurred to me early, and then I realize that it sort of applies throughout this process that you described, which is if you're putting together an RFP or you are thinking about the contract negotiation, do you sort of shoot for the moon as you're writing that and put in your entire sort of Christmas list on that? Or do you try to keep it reasonable and then have that negotiation of, I want these extras once you're in the conversation?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ben, and it's really something, I think if it's your first time out, you're gonna shoot for the moon just naturally. As you do more of these, you start to temper your asks. What I would say is, go ahead and shoot for the moon. That's a great place to start. And identify what your top 3 to 5 priorities or asks are, and have those top 3 to 5 really be the governing points of what you want to accomplish in the process. So you may have your long Christmas list. That's great if you get everything, but those 3 to 5 are really the ones to keep your eye on and stay focused on throughout the conversations.
And while we're talking, I'm just going to use a little bit of executive privilege and ask you a second question, which is the vendors want your business, obviously. And so they will often, I've seen this in the past where vendors will be operating perhaps more than one platform, or they'll be operating multiple kinds of businesses. And you have to verify, right, that they can do it all. But I've seen instances where, yes, we can do all of these things for you. Oh, you want it all done on one platform? Wait a minute, that's a different question. So how do you sort of not vet the vendor, but sort of verify that, the sales guy is telling you what you want to hear or telling you what you need to know?
Yeah, I would say that in that instance, it's good to leverage additional resources within your market. So you can ask them for referrals. Know that they're going to give you the clients that are most thrilled with them. Nobody's ever going to give you the name of a client that's not happy with their services. But it's okay to talk to any referrals that they give you and do your diligence, ask your questions, but also potentially look for other people in the market that are doing business with that provider that you're exploring, and kind of broaden your horizons and ask those individuals or those organizations more detailed questions so that you can kind of level set and truly understand, is that salesperson giving you the correct information, or are they really truly trying to seek a sale and tell you whatever it is that you want to hear?
Well, very good. Well, I see that we are just about at time. We don't have any questions from our audience right now, but I want to encourage folks to certainly reach out to Emily if anything occurs to you after this. Emily, thank you so much for presenting today.
Thanks so much for the time. I appreciate the opportunity. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.